Bismillah, Alhamdulillah. In the last lecture, part 5 of this series, we discussed sections under the Founding Fathers and the religion of America, the poverty of agnosticism, and the great prayer experiment in chapter 2 of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion book. And now we continue with responses to few specific topics in this book before discussing the topic of Darwinism today. In chapter 4, under the Worship of Gaps section, Dawkins says, creationists eagerly seek a gap in present-day knowledge or understanding. If an apparent gap is found, it is assumed that God by default must fill it. What worries thoughtful theologians such as Bonhoeffer is that gaps shrink as science advances, and God is threatened with eventually having nothing to do and having nowhere to hide. The response is, theists, believers, do not believe in God that fills gaps. Above statement by Dawkins and company is not a statement that a scholar or a philosopher or any expert in the subject matter would make. Do we think there are gaps in our understanding of the universe and our physical world? Of course, but we leave it to science to fill those gaps. There are theists as well as atheist scientists who work to find these answers and fill these gaps. Does science fill all the gaps? Of course not. Only a fraction of it. The limitation of science is totally understood by the believers. There are things the science has not discovered yet, but perhaps will do so someday. And there are things it will never discover because science is a physical tool for the natural, not the supernatural or the world beyond. However, one can say the things we discover through science become evidence toward the existence of God. When Isaac Newton discovered the formulas for gravity, he did not say, oh, I solved the problem, I filled the gap, so there is no God. In fact, he did the opposite. He said there is a perfect system in operation in the universe that obeys certain laws precisely and in harmony. Therefore, there is an architect, a designer, or an intelligent being. As such, Newton looked at the final cause. Even the scientific community cannot deny the order and precise laws and constants govern in this world, as we discussed in chapter 2 of Concept of God series. In fact, with the help of science, every day we discover the intricacy and subtle details of the order this world operates on. Dawkins starts chapter 1 with several quotes from Einstein and his definition of God, starting with chapter 1 under undeserved respect section, as he says, my title, The God Concept or God Delusion, does not refer to the God of Einstein and the other enlightened scientists of the previous section. That is why I needed to get Einsteinian religion out of the way to begin with. It has a proven capacity to confuse. Not that Einstein's belief is a proof, but one might ask, why bring it up if it has capacity to confuse? From this point on, he starts criticizing and or attacking the religion and the religious through several chapters. By doing so, Dawkins wants to say, believing in God, which is predominantly advocated by religion, hence religion itself is the root cause of many problems for mankind. He illustrates this by giving examples throughout his book. In these examples, he points to behavior of some people, no matter how fringe they may be, and says, look at what religion does. Much like his other claims, he likes to generalize or extend his conclusions to masses at large in order to drive home the harms of belief in supernatural or personal God, hence the religions that advocate it. While we know Dawkins himself knows what he's trying to do by attacking religions, we will respond to a couple of these instances for the benefit of our audience, not Dawkins, who already knows the facts. Before we review his examples, to be clear, in the context of religious folks, Dawkins does not seem to realize or does not want to realize the following facts, regardless of whether a person is religious or not. Number one, mankind has free will, hence makes choices in life and acts accordingly. Thus, his life is a combination of good and bad deeds. There are many factors and motives that derive man's decisions. Number two, among people, there are those who lead others, those who follow others, and those who do not necessarily do either, but think before they do something. They do not blindly follow or even lead others. Number three, it is in man's nature to go to extremes in anything. Number four, throughout history, mankind has used concepts, or rather misused concepts, ideas, etc., to his own gains, hence justify his actions. One must question what the motivation behind an ideological violence is. Can the political and social grievances be behind it? None of the above points are exclusive to the follower of religion. Furthermore, one cannot blame a religion for some of its followers' behavior or as teaching of the religion itself, especially when the number of such followers is very small compared to the entire population of that religion's followers. That said, have there been people who have exploited religion for their own gains? Absolutely, and especially for political gains. But then there were those who exploited Marxism, communism, capitalism, and other ideologies as well for their own political gains. So, what's the difference? With that, we start with quick examples from Dawkins' book. Dawkins mentions the word Quran in handful of occasions in his book, which happen to be the same in the same context. Thus, I picked just maybe a couple of examples, important examples among them, to address here today. On page 45 under monotheism topic, Dawkins says, several centuries later, Muhammad and his followers reverted to the uncompromising monotheism of the Jewish original, but not its exclusiveness, and founded Islam upon a newly holy book, the Quran or Quran, lists both spellings, adding a powerful ideology of military conquest to spread the faith. There is a lot to be said on this topic, and many books have been in fact written about it. But in short, Dawkins should know that Islam never advocated military conquests for territorial gain, nor to spread Islam by force. It is rather spreading Islam by the message. Unfortunately, this is one of the misconceptions and fabrications introduced by crusades and their supporters, which has no basis in reality. Any faith imposed by force creates hypocrites, meaning a person who may utter something that he or she does not truly believe in heart. And as such, Hippocratic belief in Islam has no value. There is a whole chapter in the Quran about hypocrites. Had Dawkins read the Quran, he would have discovered the explicit verse that says there is no compulsion in religion. But there is invitation, and Islam spread through its message, even in places where there were no military expeditions. Furthermore, the Quran has verses like, "O you who believe, be persistently upright for Allah, witnesses for justice, and do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just." Be just. That is nearer to righteousness. Or justifying only defensive wars, as it says, "Fight in the way of Allah those who fight you first, but do not transgress. Allah does not like transgressors." Or establishing justice and peace with those who are not launching a war against you. As it says, Allah does not forbid you from being righteous and acting justly toward those who do not fight with you because of religion and do not expel you from your homes. Indeed, Allah loves those who act justly. When Dawkins insists all Muslims adhere to literal interpretation of their book, then he should know it was due to such adherence to their book, the Quran, Muslims of the past and present did not launch military expeditions for any purpose other than defense of their faith, lands, and lives. Furthermore, history has shown you may force a nation to convert for a short while, but soon after the occupying forces leave, people will go back to their original faith. And if you study the Islamic history, you will see such thing never occurred in any country that embraced Islam. Even a segment of Mongols who attacked and occupied Islamic countries converted to Islam. Islam spread rather by preaching its message in places like Africa, East Asia, and later on Europe and America in modern times. There are numerous books written about Islamic history and how Islam spread throughout Asia and Africa, not by sword, as Dawkins likes to say, but rather uncompromised message that resonates with human nature, even to faraway places where no Muslim military was ever present. Books like Islam from Edge by Richard Bullitt and The Preaching Islam by Sir Thomas Arnold are just examples among many about detailed history. If Dawkins or anyone else has issues with the verses of the Quran mentioning jihad, struggle, war, and peace, then they can refer to my book, Does the Quran Really Say That?, which is focused on this topic and lists all relevant verses with explanations. In another place, Dawkins mentions the word Quran on page 269 in chapter 8, where he wants to say people such as Muslim extremists believe what they say they believe, as he says. The answer to this question is obvious, if only because it's been patiently articulated by bin Laden himself. The answer is that men like bin Laden actually believe what they say they believe. They believe in the literal truth of the Quran. or Quran? The short answer is, so did Hitler, Stalin, Attila the Hun, and Mongols. They all believed in what they did and justified it. We can point to them and say, here are people who did not believe in God, yet they killed more people than followers of all faiths combined, including crusades. We don't deny that religion can be a great weapon when it is exploited and misused, as the 4 points mentioned earlier, but in spite of the outdated cliche of religions are the cause for war and conflict, we can show how war and conflict are not unique to religions. In the relatively short history of secularism, many massacres have been committed in the name of non-religious ideologies such as communism, nationalism, and social Darwinism, as well as examples. And yes, we are keeping score to make the point. According to China File article, who killed more Hitler, Stalin, or Mao, published February 2018, the first reliable scholarly estimates derived from the pioneering work of the demographer Judith Bannister, who in 1987 used Chinese demographic statistics to come up with the remarkably durable estimate of 30 million. Two more recent accounts given what they are widely regarded as the most credible numbers. One in 2008 is by the Chinese journalist Yang Yisheng, who estimated that 35 million died. Then the Hong Kong University's Frank Decoder has a higher but equally plausible estimate of 45 million who died in the hands of Mao and the Chinese Communist Party. According to the same article, for World War II, if one includes the combatant deaths and the deaths due to war-related famine and disease, the numbers shoot up astronomically. Just the Soviet Union itself suffered upward of 8 million combatant deaths and many more due to famine and disease. Some historians claim that the death toll was around 20 million, a figure based on Conquest book, The Great Terror in 1968. In 2003, in his book, The Court of the Red Thezar, British historian Simon Sebag Montefiore suggested that Stalin was ultimately responsible for the deaths of at least 20 million people as well. In 2006, political scientist Rudolf Rommel wrote that the earlier higher victim total estimates are correct, although he included those killed by the government of the Soviet Union in the Eastern European countries as well. Now, regarding Hitler and World War II victims, in his book, Democide, Nazi Genocide, and Mass Murder, Professor R.J. Rommel, who coined the word democide, which he defined as the murder of any person or people by a government, including genocide, politicide, and mass murder, he estimates the Nazi democide, shown at the bottom of the table that he has in his book, the number of civilians and military men killed in the war, presumably exclusive of democide. In total, the war killed 28.7 million Europeans, excluding Soviets. But the democide of Hitler alone adds 20.9 million more, where Stalin democide during the war of 13 million people to be included. Hence, the number of people murdered by just the Nazis and Soviets alone would exceed the total European war dead. Zooming out, Rummel estimates a grand total of 212 million people were killed by all governments during the 20th century, of which 148 million were killed by communist governments from 1917 to 1987. And then you add World War I and World War II deaths to that, so it gets to about 212 million. This was just the numbers killed by communist China and Soviet, and then you add, the German World War I and World War II numbers. Not to mention all those who were killed in smaller numbers as a result of Western Europe's colonialism and, of course, America's war after World War II in Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, and war on terror, all raged by secular and communist governments. Of course, in the case of Western governments, especially America, Dawkins not just admits but insists American leaders were all secular and possibly atheists, as mentioned earlier in his book. A good book to read on this very topic of secularism is The Myth of Religious Violence by William Cavanaugh, who argues that modern distinctions between religious and secular forms of violence are not only arbitrary and unhelpful, but they are also damaging. He asserts that the very concept of the religious as something distinct from the secular is an invention of the modern West. You've had Catholics fighting against Catholics, or Protestants fighting against Protestants, or you have Catholics and Protestants making alliance against another of their own, all part of opportunistic, politically driven fights, not necessarily religiously driven. So the idea of religious past and a peaceful secular present is one of the biggest myths we have in the world today, according to Cavanaugh. This is important because secularism was supposed to be the solution, the remedy to that problem of religion. But if there was no problem to begin with, meaning if the world was not any more violent than it is today, or we should even say if the world was less violent before than it is now in 20th and 21st century, then secularism needs to account for itself. Where did secularism come from? Why does it exist? How did it change our societies, the way we look at things? What was lost? What is it that we lost? The second myth is that secularism came to separate church or religion and the state. That is not the case. Secularism rather came to bring about new religions, such as secular Christianity, secular Judaism, and secular Islam, which are easy to manage, dominate, and control by the nation states, all of which is a whole another discussion to itself for another time. Thus, we know for fact from such examples in history there are more irreligious, more atheist, secular or communist tyrants and oppressors, killers and destroyers than those who are religious, because it is rather easier for an atheist to commit any crime, large or small, when he or she thinks this life is all there is and there's no life and accountability after death. It is in fact the role of religion, especially Islam, to highlight and expand on the concept of life after death and reality of accountability for all actions in this life and ultimate justice being served in the judgment day. It is in fact the disbeliever or atheist who does not believe in the life after that have caused majority of the problems, bloodshed and destruction in this world. We must also sadly admit and include with them the segment of believers who have forgotten or have chosen to be heedless to the reality of Judgment Day and accountability in hereafter. Imagine for a moment we wake up tomorrow morning and find all people of this world believe in afterlife, accountability, and the Judgment Day, where ultimate justice will be served. I tell you, this world would be heaven already. More on this in the conclusion. Dawkins wants to compare an extremist group who makes up not even an infinitesimal percentage of a whole population of that faith's followers. A fringe group among vast majority of the followers of the same faith, hence do not even represent that faith, whom do not even share the same goals and aspirations with someone like Hitler or Stalin, who had influenced their followers in millions, more than any religion could, to support them in their massacres and grandiose plans. We asked Dawkins, who do you think did all the killings? Was it Stalin and Hitler with their own hands, or people whom they influenced? So we say to Dawkins, give up this argument because it will not get you anywhere, and the cliche of religions are the cause of war and conflict is outdated, because above numbers highlight how war and conflict are not unique to religions, and it is rather the opposite. As such, we repeat what I said in the beginning of this discussion. Number one, mankind has free will, hence makes choices in life and acts accordingly. Thus, his life is a combination of good and bad deeds. There are many factors and motives that derive man's decisions. Number two, among people there are those who lead others, those who follow others, and those who do not necessarily do either, but think before they do something. They do not blindly follow or lead others. It is, number three, it is in man's nature to go extreme in everything. Number four, throughout history, mankind has used concepts, or rather misused concepts, ideas, etc., to his own gains, hence justify his actions. I add one more, number five, quoting Professor Keith Ward, it is very difficult to think of any organized human activity that could not be corrupted. The lesson is that anti-religious corruptions and religious corruptions are both possible. There is no magic system or belief, not even belief in liberal democracy, which can be guaranteed to prevent it. Except that I would add, according to history and the numbers we talked about, the crimes of corrupted non-religious or corrupted atheists far outweigh the crimes of corrupted religious. On the same topic of the Quran, in chapter 8, page 272, Dawkins quotes an Islamophobe by the name of Patrick Sokhdio, who claims to be an Islamic expert who wrote an article in The Spectator, and now quoted by Dawkins in his book, that says, by far the majority of Muslims today live their lives without recourse to violence, but the Quran is like a pick and mix selection. If you want peace, you can find peaceable verses. If you want war, you can find bellicose verses. Then Dawkins writes, Sokhdio goes on to explain how Islamic scholars, in order to cope with the many contradictions that they found in the Quran, developed the principle of abrogation, whereby later text trumps earlier ones. Unfortunately, the peaceable passages in the Quran are mostly early, dating from Muhammad's time in Mecca. The more belligerent verses tend to date from later, after his flight to Medina, after his migration to Medina. Firstly, the very above statement about contradiction in the Quran shows he is not an expert in the Quran nor Islam. Secondly, for Sukhdio's and Dawkins' education, scholars do not have the authority to abrogate. It is rather the Quran itself that does so. Thirdly, the word abrogation, in the sense of later text trumping earlier one, does not mean complete annulment or retraction, as the Quran itself explains it in verse 2106, as it says, "We do not abrogate a verse or cause it to be forgotten, except that we bring forth one better than it or similar to it." And no scholar can abrogate any verse of the Quran. Fourthly, there are only few abrogations as defined by the Quran in Islam, most of which are about rulings on acts of worship, not about Islamic principles of belief, concepts, and moral maxims, which are all timeless. One of the examples of abrogation was changing the direction of prayer from Jerusalem to Mecca, again relevant to an act of worship. Fifthly, as a divine revelation containing the literal and direct words of God, there is no contradiction in the Quran. While Sukhdio and Dawkins do not mention or bring any example of such contradiction, we challenge them to do so. Had Sukhdio read the entire Quran and understood it contextually and its theme, he would not have made such self-exposing statements. Regarding his comment, if you want peace, you can find peaceable verses, and if you want war, you can find bellicose verses. We say, of course there is. The Quran is a true and a divine operational manual for life. Among mankind, you have those who are peaceful and those who are not. The reality, as we have seen throughout human history and continue to see today, there are those among human race who oppress, kill, destroy, commit various crimes and injustices, some in an enormous scale, like those we just mentioned a minute ago, those who want to occupy, colonize, and exploit others. And then there are those who want to live in peaceful coexistence. The Quran has verses for both and about both groups. Islam is in peace with the peaceful, period. And there are many verses in the Quran commanding as such, of which we gave few examples earlier. However, when facing the aggressor, one must defend oneself. And in Islam, there are rules of engagement for a defensive war. We also, here, we ask Dawkins, which ideology or school of thought allows injustice to go on by asking its followers to sit home and do nothing? In Islam, surrendering to injustice is a form of injustice itself. Put another way, fighting a defensive war to overcome injustice in and of itself is an act of mercy, not just toward those who are committed injustice against, but also those who are committing injustice, because it keeps them from continuing. A holy book that deals with reality of human nature, both sides of this reality, and while enjoining peace and justice, it must also lay down the law as to how to deal with injustice. Again, without getting into more details, I highly recommend Sukhdio, Dawkins, and anyone else interested to read my book, Does the Quran Really Say That?, which deals with this very topic. There are few more mentions of the Quran in Dawkins' book, but they are similar to other tattletales in his book about someone saying or doing something based on their culture or their understanding of the Quran, then generalizing it to the entire Muslim population, implying, see what the religion does. Again, none of which has anything to do with disproving existence of God. There are also many other soap opera-like stories Dawkins fills up pages of his book with and throughout that we did not get to answer, none of which are proof, and I will sum up my take in the conclusion. We now want to continue this lecture with the topic of Darwinism, which makes up foundation of what Dawkins and company believe in and rely on. Toward end of chapter 2, Dawkins talks about the theist believers who do believe in evolution. In a section called the Neville Chamberlain School of Evolutionists, Dawkins says, another prominent luminary of what we might call the Neville Chamberlain School of Evolutionists is the philosopher Michael Russ. Russ has been an effective fighter against creationism, both on paper and in court. He claims to be an atheist, but his article in Playboy takes the view that we who love science must realize that the enemy of our enemy is our friend. Too often, evolutionists spend time insulating would-be allies. This is especially true of secular evolutionists. Atheists spend more time running down sympathetic Christians than they do countering creationists. When John Paul II wrote a letter endorsing Darwinism, Richard Dawkins' response was simply that the Pope was a hypocrite, that he could not be genuine about science, and that Dawkins himself simply preferred an honest fundamentalist. By fundamentalist, Dawkins means one who does not believe in evolution, a religious person who does not believe in evolution. While Dawkins calls the Pope hypocrite and prefers fundamentalists over theists who do believe in evolution, he seems to be hotter than Darwin himself. Let's see what Darwin himself has to say about this. In the conclusion chapter of his book, The Origin of Species, page 421 in my version, Darwin says, I see no good reason why the views given in this volume should shock the religious feelings of anyone. It is satisfactory as showing how transient such impressions are. To remember that the greatest discoveries ever made by man, namely the law of attraction of gravity, was also attacked by Leibniz as subversive of nature or natural, and by the way of inference of revealed religion. Then goes on to say, a celebrated author and divine has written to me that he has gradually learned to see that it is just as noble a conception of the deity to believe that he created a few original forms capable of self-development into other and needful forms. So, to believe that he acquired a fresh act of creation to supply the voids caused by the action of his laws. Darwin here quotes a celebrated author who was a theist, yet acknowledged some form of evolution as a confirmation. Yet, Dawkins seems to be more Darwinist than Darwin himself, who admitted to being an agnostic. In a letter to John Fordyce, Darwin said, In my most extreme fluctuations, I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God or existence of a God. I think that generally, and more so as I grow older, but not always, that an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind. He also said that he saw no reason why a person couldn't be both a devout theist and an evolutionist. Charles Darwin himself stated that he saw no contradiction between the theory of evolution and religious belief. He even indicated that his theory shouldn't offend religious feelings. In his writing and letters, Darwin clarified that one could believe in a creator while also accepting evolution as a mechanism of how life developed. While Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection challenged some traditional religious views, particularly those centered on a literal interpretation of the Genesis creation story, Darwin himself did not see it as inherently incompatible with religious belief. He acknowledged that his ideas could be unsettling and even distressing for some, but he maintained that his theory did not necessarily contradict the idea of a divine creator. If we go one level above Darwin or before Darwin, it was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the French naturalist, biologist, and academic, who was an earlier proponent of the idea that biological evolution occurred and proceeded in accordance with natural laws. The modern era generally remembers Lamarck for a theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics called Lamarckism. Soft inheritance or use-disuse theory formed only a small element of his theory of evolution and was in his time accepted by many natural historians. Lamarck's contribution to evolutionary theory consisted of the first truly cohesive theory of biological evolution in which a complex force drove organisms up a ladder of complexity and a second environmental force adapted them to local environments through use and disuse characteristics in his theory, differentiating them from other organisms. In the historical sketch chapter of his book, The Origin of Species, Darwin remembers Lamarck as following. Lamarck was the first man whose conclusion on the subject excited much attention. This justly celebrated naturalist first published his views in 1801. He much enlarged them in 1809 in his Philosophie zoologique, and subsequently in 1815 in the introduction to his Histoire naturelle des animaux vertébrés. And in those works, he upheld the doctrine that all species, including man, are descended from other species. He first did the eminent service of arousing attention to the probability of all change in the organic as well as the inorganic world being the result of law. And it is interesting that when Lamarck's book came out, Darwin was just born. Lamarck indicates in his Philosophy Zoologique book, on page 30 of the translation version under evolution, that species can only maintain their consistency of form so long as their environment remains constant. Any change in the environment necessitates a corresponding change in the species. In support of this doctrine, he cites the case of domesticated animals and the altered shape which has, in their case, followed upon an altered environment. The same thing is found in cultivated plants. He draws attention further to the linear series of animals arranged in order of gradually increasing complexity to form a continuous whole, strongly suggesting development. He is far from wishing to attack the concept of theology, as he says, listen to this, if the sublime author of the universe can create all the different species by separate acts of creation, so too he can surely create one or two species to begin with and confer upon them the power of evolving into the rest. Regarding matter and thinking under psychology, on page 76 of the translation of his book, says, of the various philosophical questions agitated among the group of materialists in the latter half of 18th century, none occurred more frequently than this. Can matter think? A man is made of matter. A man can think. Hence, matter must be able to think. After going through some explanation, it says, Lamarck, however, knew too much to slide out of difficulty by such discredited method. Holding his views, it was inevitable that one of his earliest psychological problems must have been the old question, can matter think? He put it squarely to himself and decided that matter did not think. Thought was only an effect. Last example, but not the least, Lamarck summarizes it in chapter 3, pages 40 to 41 of the translation. Will anyone, it may be asked, venture to carry his love of system so far as to say that nature has created single-handed that astonishing diversity of power, artifice, cunning, foresight, patience, and skills of which we find so many examples? Is not what we see in the single class of insects far more than enough to conceive, or rather convince us that nature cannot herself produce so many wonders, and to compel the most obstinate philosopher to recognize that the will of the supreme author of all things, author with capital A, must be here invoked, and could alone suffice for bringing into existence so many wonderful things? No doubt he would be a bold man, or rather a complete lunatic, who should propose to set limits to the power of the first author of all things. But for this very reason, no one can venture to deny that this infinite power may have willed what nature herself shows us it has willed. This being so, I find that nature herself works all the wonders just mentioned, that she has created organization, life, and even feeling, and she has multiplied and diversified within known limits the organs and faculties of the organized bodies whose existence she subserves or propagates, that by the sole instrumentality of needs, establishing and controlling habits, she has created in animals the fountain of all their acts and all their faculties, from the simplest to instinct to skill and finally to reason. If I find all this, should I not recognize in this power of nature, that is to say, in the order of existing things, this execution of the will of her sublime author, again author with capital A, who was also able to will that she should have this power? This is what Lamarck, who is the originator of evolution and whom Darwin praised, has said. There are many other places in his book he mentions the supreme power or the creator. Next, Darwin himself, in the very beginning of his book, The Origin of Species, before the introduction, where he quotes few prominent scientists, quotes William Whewell Bridgewater as saying, "But with regard to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws." By establishment of general laws. He adds Joseph Butler from his analogy of revealed religion, who said, "The only distinct meaning of the word natural is stated, fixed, or settled, since what is natural as much requires and presupposes an intelligent agent to render it so, i.e., to effect it continually or at stated times, as what is supernatural or miraculous does to effect it for once." In the conclusion chapter of his book, The Origin of Species, second edition, page 248, Darwin says, "I believe that animals have descended from at most only 4 or 5 progenitors, and plants from an equal or less numbers. Analogy would lead me to one step further, namely to the belief that all animals and plants have descended from some one prototype. But analogy may be a deceitful guide. Nevertheless, all living things have much in common in their chemical composition, their germinal vesicles, their cellular structure, and their laws of growth and reproduction. We see this even in so trifling circumstances as that the same poison often similarly affects plants and animals, or that the poison secreted by the gallfly produces monstrous growth in the wild rose or oak tree. I should infer from analogy that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form into which life was first breathed by the Creator. In which life was first breathed by the Creator. When Dawkins calls out Pope John Paul as hypocrite, what does he have to say about Lamarck and Darwin with above quotes? Were they hypocrites too? Regarding Darwinism itself, which has turned out to be almost like a cult or even a religion that many atheists and even non-atheists seem to follow, while from theoretical perspective some theists believe it or may have some merits, or put another way, it does not collide with the concept of God and God as the first cause for creation, and that evolution could have presumably occurred after the creation of original species. There are those who believe, much like Freudism and Marxism, evolutionism is an outdated ideology. It had its use while it lasted and perhaps some merits for its time. However, with the laws of inheritance discovered by Gregor Mendel and later verified by the science of genetics, which flourished in the 20th century, and now with science of DNA, the concept of evolution through natural selection is becoming no more than a legend of the past, that acquired traits were passed on to subsequent generations. Thus, even to some modern scientists, such as science philosopher and geophysicist and author of many books in the subject matter, Stephen C. Meyer, David Berlinski, the author, philosopher, and mathematician, and David Gelernter, professor of computer science at Yale, to name a few, all oppose biological evolution, and for many others, mildly put, natural selection fell out of favor as an evolutionary mechanism. However, there are still those in the scientific community who dare to raise questions because, again, this theory is the only thing atheists have to argue with. Without it, they have no other explanation. Hence, they, including Dawkins, must hang on to it and protect it even more so than Darwin himself if he were to be alive today and knew what we know now. Here we start with few excerpts from modern scientists and philosophers who consider themselves opponents of biological evolution. In his book on the origin of species, Darwin openly acknowledged important weaknesses in his theory and professed his own doubts about key aspects. In his book, Darwin's Doubt, Dr. Stephen Meyer examines an event during a remote period of geological history in which animal forms appear to have arisen suddenly and without evolutionary precursors in the fossil record, a mysterious event commonly referred to as the Cambrian explosion. Darwin acknowledged it in the book when he viewed this event as a troubling anomaly, one that he hoped future fossil discoveries would eventually eliminate. Darwin knew that there was a significant event in the history of life that his theory did not explain. In what is known today as the Cambrian explosion, 530 million years ago, many animals suddenly appeared in the fossil record without apparent ancestors in earlier layers of rock. In part 1, The Mystery of the Missing Fossils, Dr. Meyer describes the problem that first generated Darwin's doubt, the missing ancestors of the Cambrian animals in the earlier Precambrian fossil records, and then tells the story of the successive but unsuccessful attempts that biologists and paleontologists have made to resolve that mystery. Even population genetics, the mathematical branch of Darwinian theory, has not been able to support the explosion of fossil records during the Cambrian period, biologically or geologically. Dr. Meyer tells the story of the mystery surrounding this explosion of animal life, a mystery that has intensified not only because the expected ancestors of these animals have not been found, but also because scientists have learned more about what it takes to construct an animal. In part 2 of his book, How to Build an Animal, Meyer explains why the discovery of the importance of information to living system has made the mystery of the Cambrian explosion more acute. Biologists now know that the Cambrian explosion not only represents an explosion of new animal form and structure, but also an explosion of information, which was indeed one of the most significant information revolutions in the history of life. It examines the problem of explaining how the unguided mechanism of natural selection and random mutations could have produced the biological information necessary to build the Cambrian animal forms. On the part 2 chapters, Mayer explains why so many leading biologists now doubt the creative power of the neo-Darwinian mechanism, and it presents 4 rigorous critiques of the mechanism based on recent biological research. In his prologue, Mayer argues, the fundamental problem confronting neo-Darwinism, as with the chemical evolutionary theory, is the problem of the origin of new biological information. Through neo-Darwinists often dismiss the problem of the origin of life in an isolated anomaly. Leading theoreticians acknowledge that neo-Darwinism has also failed to explain the source of novel variations without which natural selection can do nothing, a problem equivalent to the problem of the origin of biological information. Indeed, the problem of the origin of information lies at the root of a host of other acknowledged problems in contemporary Darwinian theory, from the origin of new body plans to the origin of complex structures and systems such as wings, feathers, eyes, echolocations, blood clotting, molecular machines, the amniotic eggs, skin, nervous system, and multicellularity, to name just a few. Mayer then continues, at the same time, classical examples illustrating the prowess of natural selection and random mutation do not involve the creation of novel genetic information. Many biology texts tell, for example, about the famous finches in the Galapagos Island, whose beaks have varied in shape and length over time. They also recall how the moth populations in England darkened and then lightened in response to varying levels of industrial pollution. Such episodes are often presented as conclusive evidence for the power of evolution. And indeed they are, depending on how one defines evolution. That term has many meanings, and few biology textbooks distinguish between them. Evolution can refer to anything from trivial cyclical change within the limits of a pre-existing gene pool to the creation of entirely novel genetic information and structure as the result of natural selection acting on random mutation. As a host of distinguished biologists have explained in recent technical papers, small-scale or microevolutionary change cannot be extrapolated to explain large-scale or macroevolutionary innovation. For the most part, microevolutionary changes such as variation in color or shape merely utilize or express existing genetic information. While the macroevolutionary change necessary to assemble new organs or whole body requires the creation of entirely new information. As an increasing A number of evolutionary biologists have noted natural selection explains only the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. Survival of fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. The technical literature in biology is now filled with world-class biologists routinely expressing doubts about various aspects of new Darwinian theory, and especially about its central tenet, namely the alleged creative power of natural selection and mutation mechanism. So, this is there's two aspects that Mayer talks about in his book. Then, in his other book, Signature in the Cell, Mayer argues that the theory of intelligent design, which holds that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, is ultimately the best explanation for the origin of the Cambrian animals, not an undirected process such as natural selection. We stop here and continue with other aspects of Darwinism and modern scientists' take on evolution and the conclusion of this series next time, inshallah. والسلام على من اتبع الهدى.